The cold had stolen the feeling from her feet an hour ago, but Maylin did not move from the splintered steps of the schoolhouse. She sat huddled in a light brown prairie dress, a garment meant for a mild Montana autumn, not the bitter heart of a January winter. The fabric was thin, the weave loose, offering no more comfort than a whisper against the wind. Snow, fine and sharp as sand, drifted around her, collecting in the folds of her skirt and dusting her black hair. Her husband, Chin, had been gone for 2 months, taken by a fever that had swept through Providence Flats with the first hard frost. With him went the quiet respect he had earned, the small buffer that had allowed them to exist here. Chin had built this school with his own hands. He had taught the children of miners and ranchers, the ones the official territorial teacher in the main town dismissed as too rough. He taught them letters and numbers, but more than that, he taught them a world wider than their dusty valley. Maylin had taught alongside him, her English careful and precise. For 5 years the schoolhouse had been their life, a small island of warmth and order. Now its windows were dark, the door barred by a plank nailed across it by the town council. They said it was for her own protection. They said a lone woman had no business running a school. What they meant was a lone Chinese woman had no place at all. The charity they offered was a one-way ticket to the railroad camps in Ogden, a place they spoke of with a knowing curl of the lip. She had refused. Therefore, the town had turned its back, leaving her to the silence and the cold. Her stomach was a tight, aching knot. It had been 3 days since she had eaten the last of the dried apples. The hunger was a dull roar in her ears, making the world seem distant and hazy. She stared at the single street of Providence Flats, watching the smoke curl from the chimneys of the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith's forge. Inside those buildings were people she knew, women she had shared tea with, men who had shaken her husband's hand. Now, when she walked through town, their eyes slid past her, as if she were a ghost. Her existence had become an inconvenience they had chosen to ignore. But the winter would not ignore her. The cold was patient. It was methodical. It was seeping into her bones, and she knew, with a clarity that cut through the hunger, that she would not survive another night. A horse's snort cut through the wind's high whine. Maylin didn't look up at first. Drifters and cowboys passed on this road often, their faces hard and closed, their eyes holding no welcome. But this sound was closer. The crunch of hooves in the snow stopped. She felt a shadow fall over her and finally lifted her head. The man on the horse was tall and broad, his frame made larger by a heavy sheepskin coat. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see a weathered jaw and a thick mustache. He wasn't looking at her with pity or scorn, but with a quiet, steady appraisal, the way a man might look at a fence post to see if it was sound. His horse, a sturdy roan, shifted its weight, its warm breath pluming in the frigid air. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a creek bed. Maylin said nothing. The words were frozen in her throat. She simply stared, waiting for him to ride on. But he didn't. He swung down from the saddle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He stood before her, his worn leather boots sinking slightly into the snow. He looked at the schoolhouse, at the board nailed across the door, then back down at her. His gaze fell to her bare feet, blue-white against the dirty snow. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "You can't stay out here," he stated. It wasn't a question. She found her voice, a dry rasp. "I have nowhere else." He considered this for a long moment, his eyes scanning the empty landscape as if searching for an answer there. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. He could get back on his horse, ride away, and forget he ever saw her. It was the sensible thing to do. It was what everyone else in Providence Flats had done. But for a reason she could not fathom, he didn't. Instead, he took a step closer. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said. "I've got a homestead a few miles up the valley. It's not much, but it's warm, and there's food." She flinched, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter. Kindness from a stranger was more frightening than the town's open contempt. It had a price she could not afford to pay. "I have no money." "I'm not asking for any," he replied, his tone even. He crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. The shadow of his hat brim lifted, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they held no guile, only a deep, weary seriousness. No one should be left to freeze. It ain't right. He held out a large, gloved hand. It was a simple offer, a bridge across the chasm of her despair. To take it meant trusting a man she did not know, stepping into a future even more uncertain than the one she faced. But to refuse it meant surrendering to the cold. She looked at his hand, then back to his steady eyes. The hope that flickered within her was terrifying, a tiny flame in a storm, but it was there. After a moment that felt like a lifetime, she placed her numb fingers into his. What she did not know was that this simple act of trust would set them both against the quiet malice of an entire town. Arthur Vance's cabin was a single, sturdy room built of rough-hewn pine, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and drying leather. It was small and spare, containing only a cot, a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, and shelves stacked with tins and sacks of flour. But to Maylin, who had spent the last week shivering in the hollow shell of her home, it was a palace. Arthur settled her into a chair by the fire, wrapping a thick wool blanket around her shoulders before ladling a steaming stew into a bowl. He moved with a quiet efficiency, saying little. He did not ask her what had happened, or why she was alone. He simply saw her need and met it. The warmth of the fire and the hot stew slowly seeped into Maylin, chasing away the deep, numbing chill. For the first time in weeks, the tight band of fear around her chest began to loosen. She ate slowly, trying not to show the ravenous hunger that clawed at her. Arthur sat at the other side of the table, cleaning a piece of tack with an oiled rag, his movements methodical. He seemed content with the silence. But Maylin knew the silence could not last. He had brought a problem into his home, and soon that problem would follow them. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice stronger now, "I am grateful, but you should not have done this. The town, they will not approve." He didn't look up from his work. "I don't much care for the town's approval." "They will make trouble for you," she insisted. "You are a stranger here, too." "I've been here a year," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "Long enough to know who runs things, and long enough to know it's wrong what they've done to you." His directness was startling. There was no pretense in him. Therefore, she felt compelled to be just as direct. "They want me gone. Since my husband died, I am an unwelcome reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That this place is not as civilized as it pretends to be," she said softly. The next morning, Arthur announced they were going into town for supplies. Maylin's fear returned instantly. To face the townspeople from the shelter of Arthur Vance's protection felt more dangerous than facing them alone. But their food stores were low, and the blanket he'd given her was his only spare one. She needed clothes, boots, something more than the thin dress she'd been found in. There was no choice. He hitched his horse to a small buckboard wagon, and they rode into Providence Flats under a sky the color of lead. The town looked just as it had from the schoolhouse steps, but now, as they passed the saloon and the land office, Maylin could feel the weight of eyes on them. Windows twitched with movement. Men standing on the boardwalk stopped talking and turned to watch. The silence was heavy, judgmental. Arthur pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Abernathy's General Store. Mr. Abernathy himself was standing on the porch, a stout man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes. He had been a friend to Chin, or so he had claimed, often stopping by the school with gifts of candy for the children. After Chin's death, he was the first to suggest she leave. "Vance," Abernathy said, his voice oozing a false heartiness that didn't reach his eyes. He nodded curtly, his gaze flicking to Maylin and then away, as if she were a stray dog Arthur had picked up. "Abernathy," Arthur replied, his tone flat. He helped Maylin down from the wagon. Her bare feet, now wrapped in rags he had provided, touched the icy boardwalk. The humiliation was a fresh sting. Inside, the store was warm and smelled of cinnamon, kerosene, and cured meat. Two women Maylin recognized were standing by the fabric counter. They saw her, and their conversation faltered. They exchanged a look, then turned their backs, busying themselves with a bolt of calico. Arthur ignored them all. He walked to the back of the store. "Ma'am," he said to Maylin, his voice a low anchor in the hostile quiet, "pick out what you need. A heavy coat, some wool stockings, and a pair of sturdy boots." Maylin hesitated, acutely aware of Abernathy watching them, his arms crossed over his chest. She felt like a beggar, but Arthur's steady gaze gave her courage. She moved toward the rack of women's apparel, her hands shaking slightly as she touched the thick wool of a winter coat. "That's mighty charitable of you, Vance," Abernathy called out, his voice laced with insinuation. "Taking in strays." Arthur turned slowly. He didn't raise his voice. "This is Mrs. Chin. She's my guest, and she'll be treated with respect in my presence." Abernathy laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Respect is earned. Her husband didn't show much respect when he started making deals he couldn't finish. Left a mess for the whole town." Maylin froze, her hand on the coat. Deals? Chin had never mentioned any deals. He was a teacher, a scholar. "What deals are you talking about, Abernathy?" Arthur asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Ask her," the storekeeper sneered, gesturing at Maylin with his chin. "She was married to him. He got tangled up with some railroad men, thought he could play their game, buy up that school plot from under the town's nose. A foolish man." The words hit Maylin like stones. It made no sense. They had been poor. Where would Chin have gotten the money for such a thing? "That's enough," Arthur said. He walked to the counter and placed a sack of flour and a tin of coffee on it. He then went and took the coat from Maylin's hands, along with 2 pairs of thick wool stockings and the sturdiest-looking pair of women's boots. He set them on the counter as well. "Ring it up." Abernathy's eyes narrowed. He looked from Arthur to Maylin and back again. He was being challenged on his own ground in front of his customers. He began to tally the prices, his movements slow and deliberate, a small act of defiance. "That'll be $6.50. It was a steep price, likely inflated, but Arthur didn't argue. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, counting out the silver coins with a steady hand. The clink of the coins on the wooden counter was the only sound in the store. He gathered their supplies, his jaw set. As they turned to leave, Abernathy delivered his parting shot. "You mark my words, Vance. No good will come from meddling in things that ain't your concern. That woman's trouble follers her for a reason." The ride back to the homestead was silent. The snow had begun to fall again, thick, wet flakes that clung to their clothes and blurred the landscape. Maylin clutched the new coat in her lap, its rough wool a small comfort against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Abernathy's words echoed in her mind. Railroad men. A deal he couldn't finish. It was a piece of a puzzle she hadn't known existed, and it cast a dark shadow over her husband's memory. She looked at the man beside her, his profile grim against the gray sky. He had defended her, paid for her things, and placed himself squarely between her and the town's animosity. But now, Abernathy had planted a seed of doubt, a suggestion that the danger she was in was not random, but earned. She didn't yet realize that the truth was buried in a small rosewood box under her bed, and that digging it up would bring a threat far greater than a spiteful storekeeper to Arthur Vance's door. That evening the storm settled in, the wind howling around the small cabin like a hungry animal. The world was reduced to the four walls of the room and the circle of light from the fire. The confrontation in town hung between them, unspoken. Mei Lin wore the new boots and stockings, and the warmth was a strange, unfamiliar luxury. But her mind was turbulent. Abernathy's accusations had unsettled her deeply. Chen had been a gentle, scholarly man. The idea of him making secret, dangerous deals was impossible to reconcile with the husband she had known. Arthur seemed to sense her turmoil. After they ate a quiet meal of beans and cornbread, he finally spoke. "What he said in the store about your husband, is there any truth to it?" Mei Lin shook her head, twisting her hands in her lap. "I don't know. Chen never spoke of business. He was a teacher. He loved books and poetry. He wasn't a man for deals." But even as she said it, a memory surfaced. A few months before he fell ill, Chen had become quiet, preoccupied. He had started taking late-night walks, and sometimes she would find him poring over papers at the table, a worried line creasing his brow. When she had asked, he had simply said it was a small matter concerning the school's future. She had trusted him. Now she wondered if that trust had been misplaced. "He kept a box," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "A rosewood box with his important papers. It's at the schoolhouse." Arthur looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "If there are answers in that box, you need to find them. What Abernathy is doing, it's not just spite. It feels like he's trying to scare you away from something." The next day the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine layer of new snow. Arthur hitched the horse to the wagon again. They would go to the schoolhouse, not to surrender, but to search for the truth. The plank was still nailed across the door. Arthur took a crowbar from the wagon, and with two sharp, decisive movements pried it free. The screech of the nails being pulled from the wood echoed in the silent morning. Inside, the schoolhouse was colder than the air outside. A fine layer of dust and frost covered everything. Mei Lin's meager belongings were just as she had left them. She went straight to the small living quarters at the back and knelt by the simple cot. Underneath, covered by a cloth, was the small, polished rosewood box. It was locked. "The key is gone," she whispered, her heart sinking. "Chen always wore it on a string around his neck. It must have been lost when he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Arthur examined the lock. It was small and simple. He took a thin piece of wire from his pocket and, with a surprising delicacy, worked it into the keyhole. After a few tense moments, there was a soft click. The lid sprang open. Inside, nestled amongst bundles of letters written in Chinese characters, were several official-looking documents. Arthur carefully lifted them out. One was a deed to the 1-acre plot the school stood on. It was made out to Chen, but across the bottom another signature was scrawled next to a line marked "Lien Holder," a man named Silas Croft. Another document was a loan agreement between Chen and Mr. Croft for the sum of $500 to be paid in installments. Several receipts were tucked inside showing regular payments. The last payment, however, was missing. And then they found the letter. It was from Croft, dated just a month before Chen's death. The tone was sharp, demanding. "The Pacific Dominion Railroad requires this land. The final payment is past due. If you cannot produce the sum of $100 by year's end, we will exercise our legal right to reclaim the property." "Pacific Dominion Railroad," Arthur read aloud, his voice grim. "They're the ones buying up everything from here to the pass. Croft must be their land agent." Suddenly, it all made a terrible kind of sense. Chen hadn't been trying to cheat the town. He had been trying to secure their home, to buy the land outright from the railroad before they could be pushed off it. He must have been just one payment away when the fever took him. "He was trying to protect us," Maylin whispered, tears blurring her vision. She felt a wave of guilt for ever doubting him. As she looked through the remaining papers, her fingers brushed against a small, folded receipt tucked into the seam of the box's silk lining. It had been hidden. She unfolded it carefully. It was from the Wells Fargo office in Helena, a money order receipt for $100 paid to Silas Croft. It was dated 2 weeks before Chen fell ill. It was the final payment. "Arthur," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and vindication. "He paid it. He paid it all." Chen hadn't failed. He had succeeded. But Croft and the railroad had either ignored the payment or deliberately concealed it, using his death as an opportunity to seize the land. And Abernathy, who likely wanted the plot for himself, was using the town's prejudice to help them. Before they could process the discovery, the sound of approaching horses made them both look up. 2 men reined in their horses in front of the schoolhouse. They were well dressed in city clothes, their coats clean, their hats new. They dismounted with an air of authority. The leader was a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and cold, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Chen?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. He didn't wait for an answer. "My name is Davies. I represent the Pacific Dominion Railroad. We're here to discuss the outstanding debt left by your late husband." The polite, empty tone of his voice was more menacing than any open threat. Abernathy was just a town bully. These men were something else entirely. They were the face of a power that could erase a man's life with the stroke of a pen, and they had just arrived on her doorstep. Davies and his associates stepped into the schoolhouse, their presence seeming to shrink the small room. They moved with the unearned confidence of men accustomed to getting their way. Davies's eyes swept over the interior, dismissing it with a glance, before settling on the open rosewood box on the floor. "It seems you've been reviewing the particulars," he said with a thin smile. "That simplifies things. As you know, your husband entered into an agreement for this parcel of land, an agreement he failed to honor before his untimely passing." Arthur stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Maylin. "That's not true. We have the receipt for the final payment." Davies's smile didn't waver. "A receipt? How convenient. Unfortunately, our records show no such transaction. What they do show is a delinquent account. The company is prepared to be generous, however. We will forgive the outstanding debt in its entirety. All we require is for Mrs. Chen to sign this." He produced a document from his inner coat pocket and held it out. It was a quitclaim deed, a legal form that would surrender any and all of her rights to the property. "You want her to sign away her home to settle a debt that doesn't exist," Arthur stated flatly. "I want to resolve a messy situation left by a man who overreached," Davies countered, his voice hardening. "This land is a key part of our planned expansion. It will be acquired, one way or another. Signing this paper is the easy way. For everyone." The threat was clear, hanging in the cold air. They would use the law, twisted to their purpose, and if that failed, they would use other means. Maylin's hand trembled as she held the final receipt. It was her only proof, a fragile piece of paper against the power of a railroad company. For a moment, her resolve wavered. Signing the paper would mean an end to the threats. Davies might even give her a small sum of money to disappear. It was the safe choice. But then she looked at the schoolhouse, at the desks Chen had built, at the walls that held the echoes of his voice. This place was all she had left of him. It was a testament to his dream. To sign it away would be the final betrayal. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not sign." Davy's expression tightened. He looked from her to Arthur. "You're making a grave mistake, Vance. Harboring a debtor, interfering with company business. The territorial marshal will take a dim view of that. Your own little homestead might come under scrutiny." It was a direct threat against Arthur. He had offered her shelter, and now his own home was at risk because of it. The cost of his kindness was becoming dangerously high. This was her chance to protect him, to tell him to step aside, that this was not his fight. But when she looked at him, she saw no fear in his eyes, only a calm, unwavering resolve. He was not a man who backed down from a fight simply because the odds were long. "I think you should leave," Arthur said, his voice low and even. Davy stared at him for a long moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "As you wish, but this isn't over. The company will have its property." He and his man turned and walked out, their boots loud on the wooden floor. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a profound and chilling silence in their wake. The fight was no longer just with the town of Providence Flats. It was with a faceless corporation with deep pockets and long arms. They had one piece of paper, one man's quiet courage, and the truth. Against the railroad, it felt like bringing a pebble to stop a rock slide. 3 months passed. The brutal winter finally broke its hold on the valley, and the world began to thaw. Patches of green appeared on the hillsides, and the creek behind Arthur's cabin ran high with melted snow. The threat from Davies and the railroad had not materialized again, but it lingered like a low storm cloud on the horizon. Arthur had not been idle. He had taken the receipt and a letter from May Lynn explaining the situation to the telegraph office in the next county over. He sent a message to a lawyer in Helena, a man he knew only by reputation as being honest and unafraid of powerful interests. The reply came a week later. The lawyer confirmed that Silas Croft and the Pacific Dominion were notorious for their strong-arm tactics and fraudulent claims. He advised them to file the deed officially at the territorial courthouse and to stand their ground. The receipt, he assured them, was a legally binding proof of payment. Armed with this knowledge, Arthur made the 2-day ride to the county seat and registered the deed in May Lynn Chen's name. The land was legally hers. Word of this traveled back to Providence Flats. When Davy's men did not return and no marshal appeared to evict them, the town's narrative began to shift. People started to realize that Abernathy's story didn't add up. They had seen Arthur Vance, a quiet homesteader, stand up to the railroad on principle. They had seen May Lynn, a woman they had tried to cast out, refuse to be broken. A few of the families whose children Chen had taught began to stop by the schoolhouse, leaving small offerings, a basket of eggs, a sack of potatoes, a jar of preserves. They were quiet apologies, admissions of their shame. Together, Arthur and May Lynn worked to bring the schoolhouse back to life. He replaced the broken window panes and mended the leaky roof. She scrubbed the floors and polished the desks until the wood gleamed. They worked in a comfortable silence, their partnership forged not in words, but in shared labor and mutual respect. He watched her hands, so delicate and yet so capable, as she arranged books on a shelf. She watched him plane a warped board until it was perfectly smooth, his movements strong and sure. A bond was growing between them, as quiet and steady as the coming spring. One sunny afternoon they stood outside the schoolhouse. Arthur held up a new, simple wooden sign he had made. He had painted one word on it in clean black letters. School. "Where would you like it?" he asked. She pointed to the space just above the door. He climbed a small ladder and nailed it into place. The sound of the hammer was solid and final. When he was done, he came down the ladder and handed the hammer to her. Their fingers brushed, and a warmth passed between them that had nothing to do with the spring sun. She looked up at the sign, then at the sturdy little building, then at the man standing beside her. Just a few months ago, she had been sitting on these very steps, freezing, starving, and utterly alone. She had lost everything she held dear. Now she was home. "Thank you, Arthur," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the schoolhouse. "A person's got to have a place to stand," he said, more to himself than to her, "and someone to stand with." The next week, 5 children arrived for the first day of the new term. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning. Maylin stood at the door to greet them, her heart full. The quiet courage of one good man had not changed the whole world, but it had saved hers. And in the harsh, unforgiving soil of the frontier, they had planted something new, something that, with care and patience, had every chance to grow. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.